Hey Allah, hello everybody, and a heartful welcome to H629. I'm here situated out in the woods. It's a bit less chilly than it was yesterday, staggering 13 degrees, and a humidity that is a bit less than yesterday. Well, on all aspects, it's more or less lovely day. I think the cover of cloud is going to open up soon. Actually, it's already doing that. I can see the sun shining through the pine trees here. It's a very lovely setting, a bit outside the block where I'm living. There is a park not long from where you parked last time. Jan, if you're watching this, it's the same park. And they let it go, this area, which I really like, because you can see both all these pine trees around me here being twisted by the wind because it's an exposed area, and further down you find beech tree and a lovely valley. And this gives inspiration to speak about Bergson, because this is a reminiscent of the olden days. It was one of the Scottish financiers here in Gothenburg, very productive but also altruistic person named Keeler, Scotsman, as most of the people coming over to Gothenburg and starting up the first little hints of industrial revolution also in Sweden. As you might know, England and Scotland were two different nations that were the first on earth to industrialize. So it's fitting to talk about somebody that was working with the effects of industrialization and how it affects thinking. And this person is Henri Bergson, and I will read him through the eyes of Carl Pribram to make a nice segue into the mysterious wonders of this fantastic explorer into the human mind, that is Carl Pribram. Now we start with a chapter that's called Conscious and Unconscious Processes. It is especially human to attempt to distinguish between, i.e., direct their attention selectively either to the endogenous or to the exogenous variables that organizes states of consciousness. Endogenous is what you could call the inside of the brain, and exogenous is the sensory part, what we take in. Philosophers in particular are concerned with such problems, and when they speak of consciousness, they mean the self-reflective consciousness that can to some extent discriminate between endogenous and exogenous factors in the organization of awareness and of behavior. Thus, we can clearly distinguish at any moment between our intentions and our actions, and between what is sense and ourselves as sensible. A famous Austrian philosopher called Brentano, who was also a mathematician, if I remember correctly. He called our sensibility for intentional inexistence, because like intentions, sensory imaging can fail to correspond to actuality. Later it was von Uexküll, a German philosopher slash scientist, and the godfather of ethology. He shortened it intentional inexistence to intentionality. Sorry. While he shortened intentional inexistence, a rather cumbersome word, to intentionality. And we should also mention very famous Julian Jaynes. Nota bene, it's an N in his surname, not an M. Jaynes. And he's the author of Consciousness and the Bicameral Mind. And he researched and came to the conclusion that self-reflective consciousness, as we experience it today, was lacking in the early period, and that the variables we now regard as endogenous were at that early period projected onto a set of deities. So what he shows is that they didn't have a reflective mind, and there are many evidence pointing towards that in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and that the reflective mind is something rather new. A less cumbersome explanation, I don't know, a more parsimonious explanation would be to attribute the change to the invention of writing in an oral with an O and then oral with an AU. In an oral culture, the opportunity for consensual validation provided by more or less permanent exogenous record is absent. Thus, it becomes difficult to sort out our endogenous, the self, and the exogenous, erstwhile bearer of tales, variables in those aspects. And therefore intentional inexistence cannot be readily discerned. And I think Pribram has a very good point here. Without writing, how can you tell what is the self and what is the no self? And I might add to that, is there a need for it? Because you are present as a person. And all those things you need to be able to understand when you only have the writing, if we put it that way, we turn the table a bit. That need to be covered with the invention of a reflective self that reflects on what you're writing. And that is not at all necessary in the same way if you live in a culture where everything is person to person. There's no other way. This is actually an explanation I really do like. And in psychiatric and psychological discourse, consciousness, when the term is used at all, which isn't that frequent, I might add, refers to the process of attention. The organization of attention can be determined endogenously by states or exogenously by sensory input, or both. A distinction is made between conscious and unconscious processes. and preconscious, etc., which refer to an ability to separate endogenous and exogenous variables that determine a particular experience and or behavior. Sorry about the cumbersome terms here, endogenous, exogenous. Well, it's good to know, though, despite this cumbersome discussion, is that the reflective aspect of consciousness is that motivates philosophical discourse. 19th century neurologists such as Freud, who came under the influence of philosophers such as Brentano, held that the cerebral cortex is the locus of a match between sensory input and state-originated brain patterns. The anatomical and to some extent physiological insight based largely on clinical data of the 19th century neuroscience community have been substantially supported. In the mid-1970s, some patients were thoroughly examined who had unilateral resections limited to the striate, visual occipital cortex, which receive the optic projections. As suspected, these patients displayed a contralateral homonymous hemanopia, i.e. blindness in the visual hemified opposite to the side of the resection. That's partial blindness. But on testing with large objects, these patients were shown to be able to locate those objects in space by pointing and to verbally identify correctly the shapes of the objects. Despite this performance, the patients continued to maintain that they could not see anything in the visual hemisphere, and that they were guessing in the task they were so proficiently performing. It was Weiss, Krantz, Warrington, and Sanders who were the investigators who discovered this phenomena, and they have it called blind sight. So you're not consciously aware that you are seeing, but you can still point to it and talk about it. A similar effect is produced when other parts of the brain cortex are damaged. Sometimes an input to the contralateral hemifield remains unattended in the presence of other inputs to the ipsilateral hemifield. Sometimes the neglect is total, as in blind sight patients. Research with monkeys has related these neglect syndromes to systems that involves the projections to cortex from the basal ganglia and other core brain structures. It's discoveries such as these which more than anything else keep neuroscientists from discarding the concept of consciousness. And to cut it short, we can see experimentally that consciousness has an effect. It makes people blind. Wow. The awareness of not seeing keeps them from pointing things out and acting as they see, as they see. But the only thing is it doesn't reach consciousness. So this leads to the question, what is it about cortex that makes reflective consciousness possible? There is currently no complete answer to this question. However, Benjamin Libet, as you all know, has provided some preliminary data which indicates that reflective consciousness is just that. Libet has shown that the awareness produced by stimulation is not immediate. A minimum of half a second and a maximum of 5 seconds elapses before the patients experience anything. It appears that the electrical stimulation must set up some state in the brain tissue. And only when that state has been attained does the patient become aware. Libet has also shown that the organization of such a state must recruit systems beyond those directly stimulated. And the interesting thing here is that reflective consciousness doesn't have a role to play. It comes into the picture much too late to influence what we do, especially when we are acting directly. What it can do is stop action by chance, more or less. It can interfere with action that otherwise would have been good, like in the example of the person who can see, but because he's not aware of it, ignores it. But it does not have, the reflective consciousness does not have the power to change our actions. And I try to make a parallel here to David Bohm to make it a little bit easier. As you can hear, Pribram is quite dense and difficult. He's writing and talking like a neurologist. But what effectively he have researched and understood is that reflective consciousness plays a role, but it's not the role that we think it's playing. It's stopping actions, it's being an obstacle to acting freely. So there might be a deeper layer of consciousness underneath this reflective consciousness. And this Bohm would call the implicit knowledge, what you know bodily. And that hollow movement is being your actions. So we can have a control of our actions when we become aware of our movements, our thinking. So this control is possible. We don't have it presently. We know it to be more or less an illusion. And that's been proven by Benjamin Libet. It was a huge uproar when it came to this conclusion, of course, for good reasons. The reflective consciousness has been something that we celebrated as being the creator of civilization, the reason for everything good, and it turns out to be doing more or less nothing. Even stopping good things from happening, like seeing. And you can imagine in daily acting what this consciousness does. And in a way, because this consciousness, and this is a point of view from both Bohm and Pribram, because this consciousness doesn't do anything really. It's not informed by reality. It's just reflecting on things that already happened. It's a time delay, as I mentioned, and that time delay is somewhere in between half a second and 5 seconds. And that's quite a lot. So maybe this is something that we can help with being proprioceptive when it comes to thinking. We don't have the control, we can gain it, and gaining the control means that we find a direction in what we do. Let me transfer that to the Alexander technique. The consciousness, as we regularly see it, can be nothing but misuse. It's a misuse of thinking that leads to misuse in action. And that can easily be shown because we now today know that our intentions are the things that makes us misuse our body. We are constantly disrupting our own balance. It's a sort of interference that is in the ground of the whole problem. And how interesting, even though still at this lecture it's sort of fussy because of the very complicated language of Pribram, of course, but it is very interesting that they come to the same conclusions. Alexander, Pribram, Bohm, and we have some more evidence, partly from Damasio. This can also be translated to Ian McGilchrist, where the domination of the left hemisphere makes it impossible for us to control our actions in a decent way. We become the victims of happenstance. But isn't it amazing? The delay to consciousness, half a second to 5 seconds. It's a lot. So every time I start thinking I did something wrong, I need to correct it. The very, very late consciousness is doing that thinking. And it's way too late. And what will happen is, as Bohm explained it, we will try to construct another action to counteract the first action. So if I move too much, too hard, there will be another action, try to slide that. And here you have exactly the rising position. When you get up out of the chair and you feel somewhere it's being wrong, you try to correct the whole thing by straightening yourself and then causing even more imbalance. And the same goes when you're standing, you try to straighten yourself. And that's the consciousness doing that acting. Delayed, way too delayed, and that is causing a wiggling. We have in ourselves a balancing function, we interfere with it, and then we try to correct it, and then you wiggle. And even though I'm mostly tensing my right knee, the tension every 4th second goes over to the left leg. It's not this visual, but it's something in that neck of the woods. So this second little more decisive looking into Carl Pribram is quite interesting, and it's amazing the parallelism we are starting to find here. And I'd say the more sources you get, the better implicit picture you get, because all these that we've been mentioning here are explicit explanations, but they do actually help to get an implicit knowledge, and we are forming something that could be an incredibly good ground for controlled actions. And into the Hollow movement, and the Hollow movement, interestingly, just only have one direction, because it's before directionality. And then you have the direction of the Alexander technique and the direction of Bergson, Elan Vital. And I think I'm going to direct this to terminate now. I thank you very much. And now the sun is coming up here from the clouds, and it's giving its warmth. And one could say that the light coming in is the light casting proprioception of the world around us. We're making something understood. And that goes to the point that we need to sort of be aware of stuff, because it's helping. The more we become aware of things, the easier it is to act. And this is this lack of awareness that seems to be the problem. We need something beyond a reflective consciousness that is more or less passively only seeing the world, not being able to discern, inform itself. Okay, thank you.